Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And we'll be reading chapter 8, and this will be part 1 today. Okay. All right, we're going to move the camera in a little bit so you guys can follow. If you have your own edition or your own book, you can follow in there, or you can follow with us here on the screen. Whatever works for you. Okay. All right, here we go. Chapter 8, Fool's Gold. The history of paper money without precious metal backing, forced on the public by government decree. The emergence of our present-day fractional reserve banking system based on the issuance of a greater amount of receipts for gold than the bank has in gold to back them up. We previously have broken down the concept of money into 4 categories: commodity, receipt, fiat, and fractional. In the last chapter, we examined commodity and receipt money in some detail. In doing so, we also established certain monetary principles which apply regardless of their form. We shall now turn to the remaining 2 categories, both of which are represented by paper and which are at the root of almost all of modern man's economic woes. Fiat money. The American Heritage Dictionary defines fiat money as paper money decreed legal tender, not backed by gold or silver. The 2 characteristics of fiat money, therefore, are 1, it does not represent anything intrinsic value, and 2, it is decreed legal tender. Legal tender simply means that there is a law requiring everyone to accept the currency in commerce. The 2 always go together because since the money really is worthless, it soon would be rejected by the public in favor of a more reliable medium of exchange, such as gold or silver coin. Thus, when governments issue fiat money, they always declare it to be legal tender, under pain of fine or imprisonment. The only way a government can exchange its worthless paper money for tangible goods and services is to give its citizens no choice. The first notable use of this practice was recorded by Marco Polo during his travels to China in the 13th century. The famous explorer gives us this account. The emperor's mint then is in the same city of Kambulak, and the way it is wrought in such that you might say he had the secret of alchemy in perfection. And you would be right. What they take is a certain fine white bast or skin which lies between the wood of the tree and the thick outer bark. And this they make into something resembling sheets of paper, but black. When these sheets have been prepared, they are cut up into pieces of different sizes. The smallest of these sizes is worth a half tornesol. There is also a kind worth 1 besant of gold, and others of 3 besants, and up to 10. There's that word again, besants. I keep thinking of Trump's Secretary of Treasury, Besant, Bessant. I forgot his first name, but anyways, interesting, eh? All these pieces of paper are issued with as much solemnity and authority as if they were of pure gold or silver. And on every piece, a variety of officials whose duty it is have to write their names and to put their seals. And when all is prepared duly, the chief officer deputed by the Khan smears the seal, entrusts it to him with vermilion, and impresses it on the paper, so that the form of the seal remains stamped upon it in red. The money is then authentic. Red because red represents blood, blood represents life. Interesting, huh? Anyone forging it would be punished with death, and the Khan causes every year to be made such a vast quantity of this money, which costs him nothing, that it must equal in amount all the treasures in the world. With these pieces of paper made as I have described, he causes all payments on his own account to be made, and he makes them to pass current universally all over his kingdoms. And nobody, however important he might think himself, dares to refuse them on pain of death. And indeed, everybody takes them readily. And that quote was from Henry Thule's edition of Marco Polo's Travels, reprinted in W. Vissering on Chinese currency, coin, and paper money. Leiden E. J. Brill, 1877, reprinted 1968 by Chengwan Publishing Company, Taiwan, as cited by Anthony Sutton, The War on Gold, Seal Beach, California. 76 Press, 1977, page 26 to 28. One is tempted to marvel at the Khan's audacious power and the subservience of his subjects to endure such an outrage, but our smugness rapidly vanishes when we consider the similarity to our own Federal Reserve notes. They are adorned with signatures and seals. Counterfeiters are severely punished. The government pays its expenses with them. The population is forced to accept them. They and the invisible checkbook money into which they can be converted are made in such vast quantity that it must equal in amount all the treasures of the world. And yet they cost nothing to make. In truth, our present monetary system is an almost exact replica of that which supported the warlords of 7 centuries ago. The colonial experience. Unfortunately, the present situation is not unique to our history. In fact, after China, the next place in the world to adopt the use of fiat money was America, specifically the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This event has been described as not only the origin of paper money in America, but also in the British Empire and almost in the Christian world. And that quote was from Ernest Ludlow Bogart, Economic History of the American People, New York, Longmans, Green and Company, 1930. Green and Co., 1930. Page 172. In 1690, Massachusetts launched a military raid against the French colony in Quebec. She had done this before and each time had brought back sufficient plunder to more than pay for the expedition. This time, however, the foray was a dismal failure, and the men returned empty-handed. When the soldiers demanded their pay, Massachusetts found its coffers empty. Disgruntled soldiers have a way of becoming unruly, so the officials scrambled for some way to raise the funds. Additional taxes would have been extremely unpopular, so they decided simply to print paper money. In order to convince the soldiers and the citizenry, that's a mouthful, to accept it, the government made 2 solemn promises. 1, it would redeem the paper for gold or silver coin just as soon as there was sufficient tax revenue to do so. And 2, absolutely no additional paper notes would ever be issued. Both pledges were promptly broken. Only a few months later, it was announced that the original issue was insufficient to discharge the government's debt, and a new issue almost 6 times greater was put into circulation. The currency wasn't redeemed for nearly 40 years, long after those who had made the pledge had faded from the scene. Probably on purpose. They wait till everybody dies and everybody forgets about it. And it's swept under the rug, right? Like they say. A classic pattern. Most of the other colonies were quick to learn the magic of the printing press, and the history that followed is a classic example of cause and effect. Governments artificially expanded the money supply through the issuance of fiat currency. This was followed by legal tender laws to force its acceptance. Next came the disappearance of gold or silver coins, which went instead into private hoards or to foreign traders who insisted on the real thing for their wares. Many of the colonies I burped. Sorry about that, excuse me. Many of the colonies repudiated their previous money by issuing new bills valued at multiples of the old. Then came political discontent and civil disobedience. And at the end of each cycle, there was rampant inflation and economic chaos. In 1703, South Carolina declared that its money was a good payment and tender in law, and then added that should anyone refuse to honor it as such, they would be fined an amount equal to double the value of the bills so refused. By 1716, the penalty had been increased to triple the value, which is 3 times the value. And that quote was from Statutes at Large of South Carolina to 211,665, as cited by George Bancroft, A Plea for the Constitution, originally published by Harper's in 1886, reprinted in Sewanee, Tennessee, Spencer Judd Publishers, 1982, page 7. The printing press and inflation. Benjamin Franklin was an ardent proponent of fiat money during those years and used his great influence to sell the idea to the public. We can get some idea of the ferment of the time by noting that in 1736, writing in his Pennsylvania Gazette, Franklin apologized for its irregular publication and explained that the printer was, with the press, laboring for the public good to make money more plentiful. The printing of money was apparently a major time-consuming operation. And that quote was from Leonard W. Lavery, editor, The Papers of Benjamin Franklin, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1960, Volume 2, page 159. In 1737, Massachusetts devalued its fiat currency by 66%, offering $1 of new currency for 3 of the old. The promise was made that after 5 years, the new money would be fully redeemed in silver or gold. The promise was never kept. And that was from Province Law 2, maybe Volume 2. I don't know what that means. 826, cited by Bancroft, page 14. By the late 1750s, Connecticut had prices inflated by 800%. The Carolinas had inflated 900%. Massachusetts, 1,000%. Rhode Island, 2,300%. And that was from Ron Paul and Louis Learman, The Case for Gold, Washington, D.C., Cato Institute, 1982, page 22. Also, Sutton, The War on Gold, page 44. Naturally, these inflations all had to come to an end. And when they did, they turned into equally massive deflations and depressions. It has been shown that even in colonial times, the classic booms and busts, which modern economists are fond of blaming on an unbridled free market, actually were direct manifestations of the expansion and contraction of fiat money, which no longer was governed by the laws of supply and demand. And that was from C. Donald L. Kemmerer, Paper Money in New Jersey, 1668 to 1775. New Jersey Historical Society, Proceedings 74, April 1956. Page 107 to 144, as cited by Paul and Lehman. The Case for Gold, page 22. By this time, coins had completely disappeared from the scene. Some were in private hoards, but most of them had been exported to other countries, leaving the colonies with little choice but to use fiat money or barter. Merchants from abroad were interested in neither of those, however, and international trade ground almost to a halt. I think almost international trade ground, I think it meant to say came almost to a halt. International trade ground almost. Merchants from abroad were interested in neither of those, however, and international trade ground came almost to a halt. Missing a word there, in my opinion. A blessing in disguise. The experiment with fiat money was a calamity to the colonists, but it was also a thorn in the side of the Bank of England. The bank had used its influence with the crown to forbid the colonies to mint their own coins or to establish local banks. This meant that if the colonists wanted the convenience of paper money, they would be forced to use the notes issued by the Bank of England. No one had anticipated that the colonial governments would be so inventive as to create their own paper money. So in 1751, Great Britain began to pressure the colonies to redeem all of their currency and withdraw it from circulation. This they eventually did, and at bargain prices. By then, their fiat money was heavily discounted in the marketplace, and the governments were able to buy back their own currency for pennies on the dollar. The decree from the British Parliament, although heavily resented by the colonists, turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The paper notes of the Bank of England never did become a primary medium of exchange. Probably because of their recent bad experience with paper money, the colonists merely brought what few gold and silver coins they had out of hiding and returned to a true commodity money system. At first, the doomsayers predicted this would spell further ruin for the colonial economy. There isn't enough money was the all too familiar cry, but there was indeed quite enough, for as we have already seen, any amount is sufficient. Tobacco becomes money. There was a time when tulip, I think the flower tulip, was currency. That was with the Indian Trading Company or the East India Company or something like that. It was a hot commodity, the tulips. I think it was tulips. Tobacco becomes money. There was, in fact, a period in which other commodities became accepted as a secondary medium of exchange. Such items as nails, lumber, rice, and whiskey filled the monetary void, but tobacco was the most common. Here was a commodity which was in great demand both within the colonies and for overseas commerce. It had intrinsic value. It could not be counterfeited. It could be divided into almost any denominational quantity. And its supply could not be increased except by the exertion of labor. In other words, it was regulated by the law of supply and demand, which gave it great stability in value. In many ways, it was an ideal money. It was officially adopted as such by Virginia in 1642 and a few years later by Maryland, but it was used unofficially in all the other colonies as well. So close was the identity of tobacco with money that the previous fiat currency of New Jersey, not a tobacco growing state, displayed a picture of a tobacco leaf on its face. It also carried the inscription, "To counterfeit is death." Tobacco was used in early America as a secondary medium of exchange for about 200 years, until the new Constitution declared that money was henceforth the sole prerogative of the federal government. And that quote was from Galbraith, page 48 to 50. The primary currency at that juncture, however, was still gold and silver coin, or specie, as it was called. Interesting name, specie. And the immediate result of returning to a sound monetary unit was a rapid recovery from the economic stagnation previously inflicted by the booms and busts of fiat money. Trade and production rose dramatically, and this in turn attracted an inflow of gold and silver coin from around the world, filling the void that had been created by years of worthless paper. The law of supply and demand was visibly at work. For a while, Massachusetts had returned to specie, while Rhode Island remained on fiat money. The result was that Newport which had been the trade center for the West Indies, lost its trade to Boston and became an empty port. And that was from Paul and Lerman, page 22 and 23. After the colonies had returned to coin, prices quickly found their natural equilibrium and then stayed at that point, even during the 7 Years' War and the disruption of trade that occurred immediately prior to the Revolution. And that was from the Colonial Monetary Standard of Massachusetts by Roger W. Weiss, Economic History Review, number 27, November 1974, page 589. After the colonies had returned to coin, prices, oh, sorry, I read that already. And that was footnote 3, and I read that too. There is no better example of the fact that economic systems in distress can and do recover rapidly if government does not interfere with the natural healing process. The government is really, really, really good at mucking things up, aren't they? War brings a return of fiat money. The war for independence brought all of this to a sudden halt. Wars are seldom funded out of the existing treasury, nor are they ever done so out of increased taxes. If governments were to levy taxes on their citizens fully adequate to finance the conflict, the amount would be so great that many of even its most ardent supporters would lose enthusiasm. By artificially increasing the money supply, however, the real cost is hidden from view. It is still paid, of course, but through inflation, a process that few people understand. The American Revolution was no exception. In order to pay the bill for independence, both the Confederation and the individual states were heavily into the printing business. At the beginning of the war in 1775, the total money supply stood at $12 million. In June of that year, the Continental Congress issued another $2 million. Before the notes were even put into circulation, another $1 million was authorized. By the end of the year, another $3 million. In 1776, another $19 million, $13 million in 1777, $64 million in 1778, $125 million in 1779, and still more. The Continental Army issued its own certificates for the purchase of supplies totaling $200 million. A total of $425 million in 5 years on top of a base of $12 million is an increase of over 3,500%. That's 3,500%. Wow. That's a lot. And in addition to this massive expansion of the money supply on the part of the central government, it must be remembered that the states were doing exactly the same thing. It is estimated that in just 5 years, from 1775 to the end of 1779, the total money supply expanded by 5,000%. By contrast, I think the 5,000 would include the federal and state, right? Combined. By contrast, the amount raised in taxes over the 5-year period was inconsequential, amounting to only a few $1 million, and a massive inflation. The first accelerating effect of this flood of new money was the flush of apparent prosperity, but that was quickly followed by inflation as the self-destruct mechanism began to operate. In 1775, paper continentals were traded for $1 in gold. In 1777, they were exchanged for 25 cents. By 1779, just 4 years from their issue, they were worth less than a penny. The phrase, not worth a continental, has its origin in this dismal period. Shoes sold for $5,000 a pair. A suit of clothes cost $1 million. It was in that year that George Washington wrote, "A wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions." And that was that quote was from is found in Albert S. Bowles, The Financial History of the United States, New York, D. Appleton, 1896, 4th edition, volume 1, page 132. Even Benjamin Franklin began to see the light. In a mood of sarcasm, he wrote, "This currency, as we manage it, is a wonderful machine. It performs its office when we issue it. It pays and clothes troops and provides victuals and ammunitions. And when we are obliged to issue a quantity excessive, it pays itself off by depreciation." And that quote was from Letter to Samuel Cooper, April 22nd, 1779, quoted by Albert Henry Smith, ed. The Writings of Benjamin Franklin, New York, Macmillan, 1906, Volume 7, page 294. When speaking of deficit spending, it is common to hear the complaint that we are saddling future generations with the bill for what we enjoy today. Why not let those in the future help pay for what will benefit them also? Don't be deceived. That is a misconception encouraged by politicians to calm the public. When money is fiat, as the colonists discovered, every government building, public work, and cannon of war is paid out of current labor and current wealth. These things must be built today with today's labor, and the man who performs that labor must also be paid today. It is true that interest payments fall partly to future generations, but the initial cost is paid by those in the present. It is paid by loss of value in the monetary unit and the loss of purchasing power for one's wages. Inflation is a hidden tax. Fiat money is the means by which governments obtain instant purchasing power without taxation. But where does that purchasing power come from? Since fiat money has nothing of tangible value to offset it, government's fiat purchasing power can be obtained by government's fiat purchasing power can be obtained only by subtracting it from somewhere else. It is, in fact, collected from us all through a decline in our purchasing power. It is, therefore, exactly the same as a tax, but one that is hidden from view, silent in operation, and little understood by the taxpayers. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson provided a clear explanation of this process when he wrote, "Every one through whose hands a bill is passed lost on that bill what it lost in value during the time it was in his hands." This was a real tax on him, and in this way, the people of the United States actually contributed those millions of dollars during the war, and by a mode of taxation that most oppressive of all because the most unequal of all. That quote was from Thomas Jefferson, Observations on the Article Etats Unus, prepared for the Encyclopedia, June 22nd, 1786, from Writings, New York, G.P. Putnam's Sons, 1894, Volume 4, page 165. Enter price controls and legal tender laws. As prices skyrocketed, the colonies enacted wage and price controls, which was like plugging up the whistle on a tea kettle in hopes of keeping the steam from escaping. When that failed, there followed a series of harsh legal tender laws. One law even invoked the specter of treason. It said, "If any person shall hereafter be so lost to all virtue and regard for his country as to refuse to receive said bills in payment, he shall be deemed, published, and treated as an enemy in this country, and precluded from all trade or intercourse with the inhabitants of these colonies." And that quote was from David Ramsay, History of the American Revolution, London, Johnson and Stockdale, 1791, Volume 2, page 134 to 136. Rhode Island not only levied a heavy fine for non-acceptance of its notes, but a second offense, an individual was stripped of citizenship. Boy, that's pretty heavy. When a court declared the act unconstitutional, the legislature called the judges before it and summarily dismissed the offenders from office. That quote, and that was from Merrill Jensen, The New Nation, New York Vintage Books, 1950, page 324. Enter economic chaos and insurrection. If the ravages of war were a harsh burden for the colonies to bear, the havoc of fiat money was equally so. After the war, inflation was followed by deflation as reality returned to the marketplace. Prices fell drastically, which was wonderful for those who were bearing it. But for the merchants who were selling or the farmers who had borrowed heavily to acquire property at inflated wartime prices, it was a disaster. The new lower prices were not adequate to sustain their fixed inflated mortgages, and many hardworking families were ruined by foreclosure. Furthermore, most people still did not understand the inflation process, and there were many who continued to advocate the paper money cure. Several of the states were receptive to the pressure, and their printing presses continued to roll. Historian Andrew McLaughlin recalls a typical scene in Rhode Island at that time, as witnessed by a visiting Frenchman. A French traveler who passed through Newport about this time gives a dismal picture of the place. Idle men standing with folded arms at the corners of the streets, houses falling to ruins, miserable shops offering for sale nothing but a few coarse stuffs, grass growing in the streets, windows stuffed with rags, everywhere announcing misery. Um, oh, sorry, I got distracted. I was expecting to read footnote number 2, but I think I read that already. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Got a little squirrel there. The triumph of paper money and the influence of bad government. The merchants had closed their stores rather than take payment in paper. Farmers from neighboring states did not care to bring their produce. And that quote was from Andrew C. McLaughlin, The Confederation and the Constitution. New York Collier Books, 1982, page 107 and 108. Idleness and economic depression also led to outbursts of rebellion and insurrection. In 1786, George Washington wrote to James Warren, "The wheels of government are clogged, and we are descending into the veil of confusion and darkness." And that quote was from Harry Atwood, The Constitution Explained, Merrimack, Massachusetts, Destiny Publishers, 1927, second edition, 1962, page 3. Two years later, in a letter to Henry Knox, oh, I wonder if that's Fort Knox. He said, if any person had told me that there would be such an formidable rebellion as exists, I would have thought him a bedlamite, a fit subject for a madhouse. And that was from iBit, page 4. Sorry about the back and forth, people. I hope that's not too confusing. Fortunately, there is a happy ending to that part of the story, as we shall see in a subsequent chapter. When the state delegates assembled to draft the Constitution, the effects of fiat money were so fresh in their minds, they decided to put an end to it once and for all. Then the new republic not only rapidly recovered, but went on to become the economic envy of the world, for a while at least, until the lesson had been forgotten by following generations. But that is getting ahead of our story. For now, we're dealing with the topic of fiat money, and the experience of the American colonies is a classic example of what always happens when men succumb to its siren call. And we will stop there for now. I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you for joining us. We will continue our reading next week with part 2. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day and a great week. Okay, bye-bye now.